I'm Dr. Duke, and I'm joined today by Matt Shea, a state representative for the great state of Washington. Matt, we've had you on the program before. I always love talking to you because you've got a really unique perspective. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is the United Nations. I mean, we are coming up to yet another milestone for the United Nations in terms of its global impact. And I wanted to ask you some questions about the United Nations. And I, for one, have long believed that we shouldn't be in the United Nations. And I know you share that view, and I want you to give me a quick overview. Why do you think the United States would be better off if we got out of the UN?
Well, each milestone seems to be a milestone of misery, as it were, with the United Nations.
More like a millstone, right?
Right, a millstone. Yeah, exactly. I really break this down into several reasons. First, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is tied in with the Muslim Brotherhood, works very, very closely with Recep Erdogan of Turkey, who really is recognized by the Muslim Brotherhood as a leader in the world. They represent a vast majority of countries in the United Nations. The rest of the countries generally, or by and large, are represented by the Socialist International. In fact, the current head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, was a former president of the Socialist International. So you have just two reasons right there not to have anything to do with the United Nations. It's run by socialists and Islamists, and we really shouldn't have anything to do with that. One of the other things that I think is clear for a lot of people, we all agree there should be diplomacy, there should be discussions, there should be conversations between countries. In fact, that was what kind of originally the United Nations was built at, a place for people to come together to prevent, large wars again. The problem is what it really was and intentionally was created to be was a supranational structure to control the world and control countries in the world. And they're very open about this. They're very open about their plans. The United Nations Agenda for the 21st Century, a 300-page, 30-chapter document, lays out in detail, even down to the local level, what that bureaucracy should look like. And, of course, it should be paid for by countries that don't necessarily agree with some of the values that are espoused by Islamists and socialists. So just a couple of reasons right there that I really kind of take a look at the first, because a lot of people don't know that that's the case. They know something is really dysfunctional with the United Nations, but they can't really put their finger on it, and that really puts the finger on it.
I want to ask you, we understand, like you said, the superstructure. This was never meant to be simply an organization a rapid response organization to try to diffuse conflict. If anything, it seems to me that the UN has a greater history of fomenting conflict. Think about just the so-called human rights committees at the UN and some of the ridiculous countries. I mean, you've got China, you've got Turkey, you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got some of the worst human rights offenders in the world who have chaired and have majorities. Countries like this have had majorities on the commissions dealing with human rights or women's rights or all of these issues that the United Nations pays lip service to. How in the world can even the United Nations justify putting countries like Cuba or Iran or China on these kind of committees?
Right, North Korea. And then you dig a little deeper even than that, and you figure out that there are certain elements linked to Chinese intelligence organizations that are trying to head entire UN agencies. And that doesn't make any sense at all. And then they would try to have you believe that, this is just, again, to create dialogue. And yet there is still this push to create some sort of a UN army that would go in, of course, with the most benevolent reasons into parts of the world to help out. And they're saying that we should trust the fact that Islamist folks linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, socialists, which that entire belief system of socialism and communism resulted in more deaths than any other belief system in the history of the world, that the folks that are those countries should be part of a peacekeeping force that we should put our hard-earned money and our treasure and our lives into. It's just ridiculous. We as countries, individually and as nation states was ordained in the Bible. The Bible talks about nation states. The fact is that it represents a particular culture, tradition, heritage, and belief. And all those diversities of belief are great, and we can continue that dialogue. We don't need some superstructure to do it, because really what this is about is not dialogue. It's about control.
These are the same benevolent blue-helmeted armies of the UN that raped its way across Africa when they were sent in as peacekeepers, right? And the thing that's so dangerous if you're not paying attention, Americans aren't paying attention to these blue-helmeted armies, is they're exempt. In the same way that these bureaucrats at the UN in New York can get parking tickets and engage in wife spousal abuse, but we can't do anything to them because they have diplomatic immunity. Think about a global army, a global police force army that is utterly indemnified from any accountability to state or national laws. That's ultimately what they'd like to see happen.
Well, yeah, no accountability. And yet we hear from folks who call themselves socialists there needs to be strong accountability in law enforcement, et cetera, and yet they turn a blind eye to what the United Nations is doing in their so-called peacekeeping forces. And this is well documented. This is not speculation or hyperbole or any sort of exaggeration. It's very, very well documented. Their plans are very well documented. And the fact of the matter is that as the United States, we have become more prosperous not because of the United Nations, but probably in spite of the United Nations. And these diplomatic immunities for a lot of these folks really have been abused, especially inside the United States. And when you go to other countries, they're beginning to question what this is all about. They're beginning to have their eyes opened. And it's very interesting to me that the same countries involved in the siege of Vienna to stop the Ottoman invasion of Eastern Europe. So we're talking about Poland under Jan Sobieski, the famous Polish king. We're talking about Hungary, the Czech Republic, Austria, Northern Italy, and several other areas. Those same countries are now banding together because the United Nations has failed in its so-called mission of peace, because the United Nations has failed in its so-called recognition of national sovereignty, and the United Nations has failed in regards to immigration policy, as well as the European Union. So these countries are coming together and they're solving the problem on their own, and it's working just fine. And I just find it historically interesting that the same areas are banding together at the same time now to stop what is happening and what rightfully can be called an invasion of Europe right now.
I love your point. Go back to the Holy League, right, that fought back Ottoman expansionism, Islamic expansionism into Europe. And those countries are, at least elements in those countries are, and they're battling sometimes their own governments, trying to stem the tide of illegal immigration, of this refugee, this manufactured refugee crisis that's really solely designed on a UN level to demographically change free nations, right? That's all that this is. And so when you think about that for a second, it's mind-blowing. And one question I have for you that's related to this. So we keep hearing from the UN that Western nations like Europe, the free nations, the United States, borders are an excuse, borders are a war crime, borders are unnecessarily harsh. Why are they not calling for the Chinese to give up their borders? Why are they not, and leave Hong Kong and Taiwan alone? Why are they not calling for the former Soviet Union, Russia, to give up its borders and back out of Ukraine? Why does the push for globalist expansion always seem to focus on advanced first world Western countries and nobody else?
Well, you have to go back, I think, to Marx. Marx was very clear that the destruction of borders was key to the implementation of socialism and communism. He was very clear that free trade was also a part of that. And it's so-called free trade because anytime the government is involved, it's truly not free trade, right? And I think that you take that now to this century, and you see the absolute hypocrisy, not just with China and Russia, but also North Korea. Will they give up their borders? Will they open their borders up to have everybody come in? No, of course not. And the fact of the matter is that nation states represent culture, traditions, values, and heritage of a particular people, and that's a good thing. I thought these folks were about diversity. Well, clearly they're not if they're trying to destroy the existing culture, tradition, and heritage of a country. There's no respect there. And candidly, I heard the other day that somebody called political correctness fascism pretending to be manners. And I thought that was an excellent, excellent point.
It is a really great point. In fact, you know where the term political correctness first came from? It came from Mao's Little Red Handbook. That Chairman Mao, the communist autocrat, perhaps the greatest murderer in the history of all humankind, coined the phrase political correctness as a way of adjusting the minds of rebellious citizens. We've only got about 30 seconds left, Matt, but give us a final word on the UN and your opinion today.
Look, we as the United States need to get out of the United Nations. Other countries will follow our lead if we do so. And I think that countries like Poland and Hungary and other countries in Eastern Europe are looking at this as an option. And I think that we need to take the lead in it. And the John Birch Society very clearly has taken the lead on this issue over the last 50 years, 60 years, and is right about it. And people are beginning to realize that we just need to make it happen.
Matt Shea, State Representative for the great state of Washington. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, dude.